Tom Cole back here with Christine Brennan, and certainly, Christine, what an honor it is to have you again on,
Thanks, Tom.
on BCSN. And Christine, thank you so much for coming back to Toledo. This is such an important conference.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're talking about steroids, and we talked off camera. We don't talk about symptoms with the gals. You know, we always do cover the guys, but you've seen it in sport. You've covered it specifically. Young ladies, young women, professionally, collegiately, high school, that are involved in steroids, what are the symptoms that their coaches, their parents are going to see?
Tom, you're absolutely right. I mean, we are putting our heads in the sand if we think that girls and women are not using steroids. It's a fact. In fact, if you go back to 1976, when I was still just graduated from high school here in Toledo at Ottawa Hills, and watching the Montreal Olympic Games.
Right.
And that really had a huge impact on me, just as an observer, to watch the East German women swimmers and East German women track and field athletes dominate those Olympic Games in 1976. And what we were hearing from athletes, just in interviews back then, Shirley Babashoff, the great American star who was labeled basically a failure when, of course, she was being beaten by cheaters, as it turned out. But she talked about how she walked into the locker room and she thought she'd walked into the men's locker room because of the voices. She was listening to the voices of these East German athletes. So the deep voices, the deepening of the voice, acne is a men or women, sure, whether it's a football player or of a track and field star, the body changing. I mean, we look at Barry Bonds, look at his picture, 20 years ago, look at him now. So many of these athletes, just look at them. Let's use our eyes and see. But those would be the things if I were a parent looking at a girl athlete, if I noticed those kinds of changes.
Christine, do we somewhat force, quote unquote, good kids, good athletes, good gals, good boys, men, to consider that? Because what I see, just what you said, I've had some friends that played on a professional basis, and they would tell you, especially up front on the lines, they'd say, hey, some of these guys that I was playing across from, they knew were doing things and they could not compete. Now, are we, if we don't clean this up in sport, are we going to force eventually good people with the right attitude in sports to do it naturally to consider doing that?
I think that's already happening. It's a great point, Tom, because you look at a lot of these people, say the cyclists in the Tour de France. You know, they're all looking at other people and say, hey, if he's doing it, I'm going to do it. We saw that in the Olympics, with certainly with U.S. athletes, whether they tested positive or they were able to, get out of testing positive, were able to get around the system, get it out of their body in time. Just because there's, by the way, a negative drug test doesn't mean they're not cheating.
Sure.
Just means Ben Johnson passed.
They're a step ahead of the system.
Ben Johnson testing positive in '88. He was able to pass a lot of drug tests in his career, over 50, but he got caught once.
The science stays ahead of the system is basically
the bad chemists are way ahead of the good chemists. But it's absolutely true that there's this kind of, if you can't beat them, join them kind of mentality. And we in journalism, I think I am very disappointed in some of my colleagues over the last 10 or 15 years. I've either been lucky or unlucky enough as a journalist to cover the Olympics, and of course very lucky to cover the Olympics, but unlucky to have this steroid story just drop into our lives. But I also feel as a journalist that it's the story of our lives, and we have to cover it, even if it's a sad, unfortunate story in our world. And so I've been covering this for 18 years. I'm stunned at how some of the baseball writers have failed to pick up this story, and some newspapers have basically let it go on in sports that are so essential for creating role models for our kids, like baseball. And I think that's where the problem lies. We create heroes. We are cheering for the home runs to leave the ballpark. Oh, by the way, take a look at Barry Bonds and what he looked at 20 years ago, what he looks like now. And I think therein lies the problem. But corporations, sponsors, home runs, owners of baseball teams are all complicit, in my mind, in terms of creating this atmosphere where a kid today, a high school boy or girl, will say, hey, if it works for these superstars, multimillionaires, why shouldn't I try it?
Well, Christine, doesn't it, you've covered so effectively on ESPN, your column in USA Today, you're an accomplished author, you see this. Isn't it just a money grab? It seems a money grab to me. It's I'll turn my head because just what you said, this guy's going to hit 70 home runs or 68 home runs, a lot of attendance, going to sell a lot of merchandise, we're going to sell a lot of jerseys. But the message you're giving to the young kids at home is horrific.
Tom, baseball made a huge mistake back during the 1990s after the strike. They decided that home runs would be the thing to bring fans back. understandable money-wise. But in terms of that, they decided not to do drug testing. So the Olympics started in 1972. Baseball started in 2004. Baseball is 32 years behind the Olympics, and the Olympics hasn't solved its problem yet. So I think that's what the issue is with baseball. It was all about getting fans back, all about home runs leaving the park and making money, and not thinking at all about the health and the welfare of their athletes.
Christine, you always think about the health and welfare of everyone that you cover. And thank you so much for being concerned with Toledo and coming to this conference. And the B in BCSN, I think, is Brennan. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom.
We'll be back with more.